March 6, 2008. A conference room on the 27th floor of Bangkok's Sofitel Hotel. A Russian man pulls a map of South America from his briefcase, spreads it across the table, and asks two strangers to show him where the American radar installations are. He's offering 100 shoulder-fired Igla missiles, Russian-made surface-to-air weapons designed to lock onto the heat signature of a helicopter and bring it down with a single shot. He names the targets himself: Apache gunships, Blackhawks, American pilots. He says he can airdrop the whole package into the Colombian jungle using combat parachutes, and he'll throw in trainers to teach the buyers how to use everything. He doesn't know that Thai police and DEA agents are recording every syllable from an adjacent room. He doesn't know the two men sitting across from him aren't guerrilla commanders. And he definitely doesn't know that the agency running this sting used the exact same playbook to catch a different arms dealer just 1 year earlier. This is Victor Bout, the man a British cabinet minister nicknamed the Merchant of Death, a man who armed both sides of at least 4 African civil wars, who operated 60 aircraft and 30 shell companies, who was paid in uncut diamonds and laundered the money through a shadow network spanning 3 continents. A man the United States military paid $60 million to fly cargo into Iraq. So how does the most elusive arms dealer on the planet walk into a trap he's spent 20 years being too smart to fall for? To answer that, you need to understand what's sitting on each side of that Bangkok table. On one side, the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, America's federal narcotics agency. But by the 2000s, its international strike forces had expanded well beyond drugs into arms trafficking and terrorism finance. In 2007, a DEA team was assigned Bout's case. The man leading the operation was Lou Milione, a former actor turned supervising agent. His chief of operations for the International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Division, Mike Braun, had already used an almost identical scheme to arrest a Syrian arms dealer named Monzer Alcázar. Alcázar was arrested in Spain in 2007 after DEA agents posed as buyers from the FARC, extradited to New York, and convicted. The playbook had already worked once. Braun was convinced it would work again. His reasoning was simple. Men like Bout have enormous egos. They can't believe anyone would try the same trick twice. But the DEA didn't need Bout to deliver a single weapon. They needed him to agree to sell them, on tape, for the stated purpose of killing Americans. That's the legal threshold. That turns a commercial transaction into conspiracy to murder U.S. nationals and material support for terrorism. Everything about the operation was engineered toward that single recorded moment in Bangkok. You're probably wondering how a former Soviet military translator ended up controlling the largest private arms network on Earth. In 1991, when the Soviet Union dissolved, a young lieutenant named Victor Bout was discharged from the army. He'd been trained at the Military Institute of Foreign Languages in Moscow, spoke Portuguese, English, French, Arabic, and Farsi. Russian sources claimed the GRU, Soviet and later Russian military intelligence, the agency that trained spies and ran covert operations abroad, staked him 3 Antonov cargo planes to get started. Antonovs, massive Soviet-era aircraft built to haul tanks across Siberia, repurposed after the Cold War as the backbone of Africa's gray market air freight. By 28, Bout was operating out of Sharjah International Airport, a small emirate next to Dubai whose cargo hub in the 1990s asked very few questions. He sold to Charles Taylor's Liberia, to UNITA in Angola, a rebel army in one of the bloodiest civil wars in African history and one of his earliest clients. Hundreds of tons of Bulgarian munitions flown in for an estimated $15 million. He sold to the Afghan Northern Alliance, never filtering by ideology, only by ability to pay. That model, the willingness to arm anyone, was exactly the vulnerability the DEA would exploit. By 2003, Bout's logistics network was so reliable that Pentagon contractors hired his affiliated companies to fly roughly 1,000 supply missions into Iraq. They paid his firms an estimated $60 million. The military provided 500,000 gallons of fuel to his pilots. Some of those flights happened after President Bush signed an executive order on October 31, 2006, freezing every U.S.-linked asset Bout controlled. Bank accounts, shell companies, aircraft leases, all of it locked overnight. And UN officials indicated the United States had previously pressured Security Council members to keep Bout off a sanctions list because the US and Britain were using his services. Then the same government that hired him declared him a threat to national security. Bout retreated to Moscow. An Interpol red notice, a global alert requesting any member country detain him on site, had been active since 2002. His network was shrinking month by month. Smoulian later put it plainly in an email that would surface in the criminal complaint. All assets, cash and kind, frozen, total value around $6 billion, and no ability to travel anywhere outside home territories. The man who had armed 4 civil wars was grounded, and he began looking for a deal large enough to rebuild. The man who had armed both sides of 4 wars was now desperate enough to arm the enemies of the only country that had ever actually paid him on time. The DEA's way in was a man named Andrew Smoulian, a British-born former South African Air Force officer and bush pilot, known to everyone as Babu, Swahili for grandfather. Smoulian had worked with Bout since the late 1990s. He'd once been asked by Bout to help airdrop weapons into Chechnya. The DEA reached Smoulian through a former SAS soldier, British Special Forces, named Mike Snow, who'd known both men from the African cargo circuit. Snow asked Smoulian one question: could he get to Victor Bout? January 10, 2008, a restaurant at the Hilton Hotel in Curaçao, the Caribbean. 3 DEA confidential sources sit across from Smoulian. 2 of them are former drug traffickers turned informants. Carlos Sagastume, a Guatemalan army veteran who'd made $370,000 selling cocaine before flipping to the DEA, played the negotiator, going by Eduardo. Ricardo Hardenero, a Colombian-born former soldier who'd spent a decade in the Colombian army in time-shipping weapons for a paramilitary group, played the FARC commander, going by El Comandante. On tape, Smoulian says, "Here is fine because nobody's watching us." He's wrong. Everything is being recorded. Smoulian sizes up the supposed FARC buyers. They size up whether he can actually deliver Bout. The meeting ends with Smoulian agreeing to fly to Moscow and present the deal in person. At Bout's Moscow apartment, Smoulian briefs him. And here's where something unexpected happens. Bout's first reaction is to refuse. He tells Smoulian he doesn't deal with drug dealers. But then Smoulian explains the scale of the order. Surface-to-air missiles, thousands of rifles, helicopters. Bout warms to it. According to Smoulian's later testimony, Bout sympathized with the FARC's left-leaning ideology and offered to provide guerrilla warfare instructors. For a $20 million down payment, he'd arrange cargo planes to airdrop 100 tons of weapons into Colombia. Bout didn't say yes right away. He directed Smoulian to continue discussions. Meet the buyers again, over 2 weeks, in Romania, but Bout himself stayed in Moscow. Never be in the room until you control the room. That was the pattern that had kept him free for 2 decades. But the DEA's patience matched his. They let Smoulian set the pace. They gave him a cell phone at the DEA's direction, so his calls to Bout would be intercepted by cooperating foreign intelligence services. They handed him a digital memory stick with specifications for the missiles and rocket launchers. Between meetings, Smoulian emailed Bout using code words. Weapons were agricultural products and cashew nuts. Russia was bare land. Bout went by Boris. Meanwhile, in a smoke-filled command post inside a Bucharest police station, the DEA team sat day after day, checking phones and emails, waiting for confirmation that Bout was coming. He wasn't. Not yet. Bout's operational security held. He stayed in Moscow, communicated only through Smoulian, and probed the buyers without exposing himself. But Smoulian kept relaying offers that grew larger with every meeting. 100 Igla missiles available immediately. Helicopters that could, in Bout's words, wipe out other helicopters, armor-piercing rockets, 5 tons of C4, military-grade plastic explosive, moldable like clay, stable enough to transport but powerful enough to demolish a building. A $5 million fee to airdrop everything using combat parachutes. Every detail was recorded. But the DEA needed Bout himself, not his middleman. They needed his voice on tape, stating the weapons were for killing Americans. Without that, they had a case against Smulian and a pile of circumstantial evidence. The plan was to get Bout to Romania. The DEA had coordinated with Romanian authorities, but Bout's visa was denied at the last minute. The entire 4-month operation stalled. Bout suggested alternatives: Vietnam, Cuba, Montenegro, Morocco. Each one presented logistical or legal obstacles. The DEA needed a country with cooperative law enforcement, one where arrest warrants could be executed quickly. Thailand emerged as the answer. Bout could enter. The DEA had a long relationship with Thai law enforcement. The FARC cover held firm because the real FARC was, at that exact moment, genuinely trying to acquire surface-to-air missiles. Documents seized during a Colombian military raid at a FARC camp in Ecuador confirmed it, and intelligence suggested Bout himself had been trying to sell armored vehicles to the FARC even before the DEA sting began. The cover didn't just look real, it overlapped with reality. So the informants pushed one final message through Smulian. The deal was too large for intermediaries. The FARC commanders would only close face-to-face. Bout's need for the deal outweighed his caution. 2 decades of never being in the room until he controlled the room, undone by 4 months of being unable to leave the house. Bout booked a flight to Bangkok. He landed at Suvarnabhumi Airport shortly after 10 in the morning with a Lonely Planet guide to Colombia in his suitcase. He was already imagining himself there. At the Sofitel, Jardinero, El Comandante, met Bout while waiting for the elevator. Another informant introduced them. "My friend, this is the Comandante." Bout shook his hand. They rode up to the 27th floor. Jardinero wore a white t-shirt, jeans, and hiking boots. Bout carried his briefcase. Inside the conference room, Bout moved fast. He unzipped the briefcase, pulled out documents, spread maps on the table. Jardinero would later testify that the speed surprised him. At that rhythm, "Oh, perfect," he said. "It surprised me because he did it so fast." Bout suggested conducting the deal under the alias Alejandro. He proposed referring to countries by code numbers. The informants let him lead. Then they steered. Jardinero told Bout the missiles were for use against Apache and Black Hawk helicopters operated by U.S. personnel in Colombia. This was the moment the DEA had spent 4 months building toward. Bout didn't deflect. He didn't change the subject. He leaned in. He said he understood. He told the men in that room, "We have the same enemy." He said the FARC's fight against the United States was also his fight, that he'd been fighting the United States for 10 to 15 years. He offered the Zu-23, a Soviet anti-aircraft autocannon that Sagastum Eduardo had never even heard of before that meeting. He offered to send trainers. He pulled up a computer folder on his laptop labeled FARC and showed internet bookmarks organized under a Colombia category. He'd done his homework. He had never cared who the weapons killed. That was the point, and that was the crime. Moments after Bout and the informants stood to shake hands, Thai policemen and DEA agents burst through the conference room door, weapons drawn. The Thais commanded him to put his hands up. Bout raised his arms. He was shoved against the wall, legs spread. A few minutes later, Tom Pasquarello, the DEA's regional director in Bangkok, walked in and found Bout sitting calmly at the table. Pasquarello introduced himself and asked if Bout knew what was going on. "The game is over," Bout said. Nobody in the room was sure what he meant. Smulian, arrested alongside Bout, volunteered to cooperate with the United States the very next day. He flew to New York. Bout stayed. He stewed in a Bangkok prison for more than 2 years, 70 inmates crammed into a cell built for 20, complaining about the heat, the food, conditions he called absolutely unsuitable for any civilized person. Russia fought hard to block extradition. Officials noted that soon after the arrest, Moscow and Bangkok agreed on the sale of Mi-17 helicopters to the Thai military. Arms for an arms dealer's freedom. A lower Thai court actually ruled in Baut's favor in 2009, saying the FARC was a political movement, not a terrorist organization. The US was one ruling away from watching Baut walk back to Moscow, untouchable forever. But in August 2010, a higher court reversed the decision. On November 16th, Baut was whisked out of Thailand without the knowledge of his lawyer, the Russian embassy, or his wife. He wore a bulletproof vest over a blue tracksuit. Ala Baut rushed to the prison when she heard the news. She arrived too late. His trial began in a Manhattan federal courthouse on October 11, 2011. Baut appeared in a crisp black pinstriped suit, his thick brown hair trimmed short. His wife and teenage daughter arrived after proceedings started. He stared at the jurors. The defense argued he was a businessman who came to Bangkok to sell cargo planes, not weapons. That Smullyan and the informants fabricated the weapons discussion. Then, prosecutors played a recorded phone call between Baut and Smullyan, captured on the DEA-provided cell phone, in which Baut discussed weapons logistics in detail. No mention of aircraft sales. Jury forewoman Heather Hobson later told the New York Times that this single recording destroyed the defense. It showed Baut hadn't given serious thought to the plane story. The thing he claimed was his real purpose at the meeting was the thing he'd barely planned. The jury convicted on all 4 counts after less than 2 days of deliberation. On April 5, 2012, Judge Shira Scheindlin sentenced Baut to 25 years, the statutory minimum. She noted there was no evidence he would have committed these crimes without the sting operation. Then she ordered him to forfeit $15 million. 20 years of never leaving a paper trail, undone by one phone call he didn't know was being recorded. Before sentencing, Baut made a statement. "They will try to lock me up for life, but I'll get back to Russia. I don't know when, but I'm still young. Your empire will collapse and I'll get out of here." He served 10 years. On the morning of December 8, 2022, guards knocked on his cell door at a federal penitentiary in Illinois, a cell where he kept a photo of Vladimir Putin on the wall. They told him to wake up and pack. He was going home. Hours later, on a runway at Al Bateen Executive Airport in Abu Dhabi, Victor Baut passed within a few feet of Brittney Griner, the American basketball star who had been detained in Russia on drug charges, the human being the United States had agreed to swap for Victor Baut. One walked toward a waiting American plane, the other walked home.